Tonight on KQED Newsroom, a horrifying double stabbing on BART left a teenager dead. We'll talk to BART's police chief about safety on the regional transit system. And former CIA Director Leon Panetta joins us to discuss Russia, tensions with Iran, and other national security concerns. Plus, the week's top political developments, including the latest deadline to reunify families separated at the border. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with security on the Bay Area's rapid transit system, BART. John Lee Cowell has been charged with murder in last Sunday's fatal stabbing of 18-year-old Nia Wilson and the attempted murder of her older sister, Latifah. Police are still investigating the motive behind the attack, which took place at the MacArthur BART Station in Oakland. Still, protesters took to the streets angry and worried that the stabbing of two young black women was racially motivated. BART is now under fire for not sharing information promptly about two other recent incidents that resulted in fatalities, raising concerns about security and transparency. Joining me now is BART's police chief, Carlos Rojas. Chief, nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
There are lots of questions now about whether BART is safe. Are you making any security changes in the wake of the stabbing that happened on Sunday?
Yes, absolutely. What we've seen over time is that our crime has actually at the same rate as last year. So our crime hasn't gone up, but we had these three horrible incidents. So we are increasing our patrols throughout the system in the stations and on the trains. When
you say increasing patrols, what does that mean? Because it's my understanding that your force is currently 25 officers short of what it's budgeted for. So what are you doing in that regard?
Sure. We do have 25 vacancies, and we are being very aggressive in recruiting. When I came here a year ago, we had over 40 vacancies. So we dropped that down to 25, but we still need to fill those. But we've been using overtime to get our officers in the stations on the trains to supplement the officers that are on the regularly scheduled workday.
So prior, from what you and your deputies have said, that you had one officer for every 2 to 3 stations. There are 48 BART stations. So with these changes that you're putting in place now, how many officers do you have patrolling per station, and for how long?
Well, of course, it will vary time of day, day of week, because we also look at the hot spots in the area and the calls for service. So, you know, it could be anywhere between 25 to 40 officers at any given time. But also we want to focus in the areas that are either generating the more calls for service, or the ones that are problematic with quality of life issues that are making riders feel unsafe.
Which areas would those be?
Our busiest stations are San Francisco and the Oakland stations for calls for service, but we got to make sure as a regional police department that we have adequate coverage and attention throughout all 4 counties that we serve.
And do you think these changes that you're making are enough to keep riders safe?
Well, we are definitely continuing our hiring effort. We do need to hire more police officers to continue to increase safety. And I think we're on the right track. And there are, you know, tips that we give to our riders to make sure that they can do some things to help in the effort of making BART as safe as possible.
What are some of those tips? What would you advise people?
Sure. One of the problems that we do have throughout the system are the cell phone thefts. So we really encourage folks to keep their laptops and their cell phones secured when they're coming up to stations, to be aware of their surroundings, to try to avoid sleeping while on the train. And, you know, oftentimes, you know, there's an adage in the criminal justice system where opportunity makes the thief. And we don't want to give those opportunities to individuals that are looking to take advantage of people.
But I think what has the most attention right now, national attention even, are the violent crimes, particularly Sunday stabbing. And you mentioned earlier that crime has not really risen on BART over the past year. But if you look at State Department of Justice figures over a decade, they show that violent crimes on BART has actually increased by nearly 70% over the past decade. This happened at a time when such crimes fell 7% across California. What do you think accounts for this rise in violent crime on BART?
Well, truly, these 3 past incidents that have been categorized as homicides are really an anomaly in our system, because we don't see that level of violence. But what we have seen over time have been the phone snatches, which are documented as violent crimes when force or fear is used to take somebody else's cell phone. But in terms of these recent violent crimes that occurred, definitely an anomaly, not something that we have seen in the past. And that's why, you know, very proud that we took the prompt actions that we did to bring 2 of the 3 suspects into custody.
BART has been, since you mentioned those two other assaults, BART has been criticized for a lack of transparency, including on those two assaults. In addition to the Sunday stabbing, this is on top of other lapses in the past, decoy cameras that didn't work, failing to inform the public of a takeover robbery by a mob of juveniles. How do you respond to concerns that BART is not open and honest with the public about these things?
Well, first of all, I do want to address the two incidents that occurred, because I was not here during those previous incidents. But what I can tell you, that on those two incidents, we had to wait for an autopsy to determine the cause of death on one of the incidents, and on the other one, the person did not pass away until Sunday. So literally, it was a timing issue where the very next day we put out the information on all three homicides. Within a very short period of time, all that went out to the public. So I believe that is transparent, and you also need to give time for the investigative process to work through it to make sure that we're providing accurate information to the public.
Fair enough, because you've been on the job for only about a year now, so you're right. The other things happened before your tenure, but given what has happened and given the ongoing public concerns, are you planning any additional changes in the reporting out of crimes on BART?
Well, we're constantly looking at how we can improve that. We do have a public log that people can sign into. We also have crimemapping.com, which is very common in the policing industry, which is automatically feeds from our computer-aided dispatch system to the internet, and anybody with internet access can take a look at that as well.
Have you had any conversations with the family of Nia Wilson, the young woman who died in the stabbing on Sunday?
I've had conversations with their spokespeople, and I've left a message for the father, and obviously they're going through a very difficult time. And
what did you say?
Just expressing my condolences, not only on my behalf, but on the behalf of the men and women of the BART Police Department. It's a very tragic incident.
There have been some protests and marches, as you know, and some members of the community who feel that the attack was racially motivated. Mr. Cowell, the suspect, is white. The two women who were stabbed are black. What would you say to those who have these concerns about whether the attack was racially motivated?
Well, I'm definitely sensitive to that perspective, and I just want to say that up to this point, we haven't found a connection to say that it was racially motivated, but it's not something that we take off the table. So if information does come to light that it was racially motivated, we will get that information to the district attorney's office immediately, and they can decide whether a hate crime would be appropriate to be filed.
All right, and just real quickly, we have about 15 seconds. What more do you need from city, county, and state officials to improve safety on BART? Your number one wish?
I think it's a collaborative effort. We need to work in a positive way and really support civility amongst all to make it safer.
All right. BART Police Chief Carlos Rojas, we thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Now to international affairs. On Wednesday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo faced tough questions from lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Pompeo tried to assure lawmakers that U.S. policies toward Russia had not changed, but he was unable to provide details on the private meeting that took place between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. Meanwhile, the White House announced it would postpone a second summit with Putin until after the midterm elections. Earlier this week, tensions were heightened between the U.S. and Iran by an exchange of threats between Mr. Trump and Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. For a perspective on this and other foreign policy developments, we're joined now by Leon Panetta from Monterey. He served as CIA Director and Defense Secretary under President Obama. Secretary Panetta, always nice to have you with us.
Nice to be with you.
Well, there are reports that Special Counsel Robert Mueller is now looking into tweets from President Trump about Attorney General Jeff Sessions and also former FBI Director James Comey. And then separately, federal investigators have asked to interview Alan Weisselberg. He's the Chief Financial Officer for the Trump Organization. What is your reaction to all these developments this week?
I think it's an indication that Bob Mueller is reaching that point in his investigation where he is looking pretty closely at the president with regards to issues of obstruction and probably issues of collusion as well. I think the tweets, obviously looking at the tweets, I think the purpose of that is to determine whether or not you can pull together an obstruction case based on those tweets. I think clearly looking at his finance guy relates to tracking the money and whether any of that money leads to Russia.
And I wanted to also ask you about this week's Senate hearing where Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that President Trump has taken tough actions against Russia. What is your assessment of that statement?
I thought that Mike Pompeo's testimony really presented a disconnect. He, on one hand, talked about U.S. policy being against Russia, being for NATO, for our allies, basically reflecting, I think, more traditional positions in terms of the United States. But at the same time, you have a president who basically speaks against those very positions. He talks and criticizes NATO. He criticizes our allies. When he stood up with Putin, he said he trusts the Russians more than he trusts our own intelligence agencies with regards to election interference. So there's a very great disconnect here, and it creates a lot of confusion, not only for our allies in the world, but also for ourselves.
And you touched on a point I wanted to ask you about, which is when he doubted his own intelligence community's conclusion that Russia had interfered in the 2016 election. Your former CIA director, what was your reaction to that?
I'm very concerned when the president speaks in a way that undermines the credibility of the intelligence that's provided to the president. When he does that, those that are out there putting their lives on the line in order to gather that intelligence worry about whether or not their credibility is being questioned. And so it does impact on their morale.
And does that undermining also continue when the president is doing things like threatening to revoke the security clearance of former officials who had criticized how he handled the Helsinki talks?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for the president to threaten revoking a security clearance, not because someone has violated that security clearance and revealed classified information or engaged in some kind of behavior that abuses that particular security clearance. The reason he's doing it is because he doesn't like what people are saying about him or his policies. And that goes against the grain of what this country is all about. This country is built on free speech, the ability to say what you think, and the fact is to have a president who takes retribution out on those he doesn't like because of what they say, I think not only abuses his power with regards to security clearances, it goes against the fundamental free speech principle that is so important to our democracy.
And also this week, President Trump had a testy exchange of words with Iran's President Hassan Rouhani. What kind of impact do you think that is having in both countries?
We're at a difficult place now with Iran. The president basically tore up the agreement on nuclear development by Iran. It was the one agreement that all the parties agreed was restraining Iran from moving forward with developing a nuclear weapon. That agreement, from the United States' point of view, is out the window. And so the question now becomes, how are we going to deal with Iran? We've engaged now in a war of words. President Rouhani criticizing President Trump. It could lead to some kind of confrontation. On the other hand, the hope is that it might lead to some kind of negotiation. But I think we are going to see a period of tremendous volatility ahead of us in the relationship with Iran.
Well, speaking of volatility and nuclear programs, this week Secretary of State Pompeo also acknowledged for the first time that North Korea is continuing to produce nuclear fuel. That runs counter to the administration's claims that it was making progress on the denuclearization of North Korea. How concerned are you about this revelation from Secretary Pompeo?
Well, I'm very concerned because it only confirms that we have yet to receive from North Korea any kind of real commitment, verifiable, enforceable commitment to eliminate their nuclear weapons and engage in denuclearization. The summit meeting was kind of a PR event, but when the balloons and all the confetti went away, the reality is we have yet to see North Korea take any steps with regards to eliminating their nuclear capability. And so it remains, I think, as opposed to what the president said, it still remains a serious nuclear threat to the United States and to the world.
All right. Secretary Leon Panetta, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Continuing with politics and their impacts on California, Thursday was the deadline for the federal government to comply with a court order to reunite families separated under the Trump administration's zero-tolerance immigration policy. Government officials say about 1,400 children were returned out of 2,500 children who were taken from their parents. But there are multiple reports of failed reunifications. That's raising questions about whether the deadline had truly been met. Meanwhile, a full-blown tariff war between the European Union and the U.S. appears to be averted for now. It's unclear how California will benefit from $12 billion in emergency aid to help U.S. farmers affected by the new tariffs. Here with me now to discuss these developments are KQED political reporter Marisa Lagos, Hoover Institution fellow Lanhee Chen, and political senior writer Carla Marinucci. Hello to you all. Hi. Well, Lanhee, from a Republican perspective, you just heard what Secretary Panetta had to say about the Russia investigation and Secretary Pompeo's testimony. What is your reaction to all that?
I think there is a dissonance here. I think the Secretary raises an interesting point, which is on the one hand, the administration is conducting policy toward Russia in a way that's relatively consistent with previous Republican administrations, arguably tougher than the previous administration with respect to sanctions and a few other areas. But then you have the rhetoric coming from the administration and particularly from the president, less so the administration. I think Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Mattis have been very clear. John Bolton's been very clear regarding what they believe the U.S. posture toward Russia should be. The president is the one, I think, who has sent mixed messages. And so if this administration wants to get on the same page, it starts at the top. So ultimately, it's the president and his rhetoric that need to be addressed.
And it is, I mean, so interesting because we've seen so many breaks with protocol in so many ways with this president. But in particular, this meeting one-on-one with Vladimir Putin, only having their, translators in the room, not having anybody from his cabinet or from national security intelligence. And so it's hard to know even what Secretary Pompeo knows about what was said or anybody else within the administration.
We saw Pompeo alongside James Mattis this week at Stanford, at Hoover Institution. He seemed uncomfortable. He bristled at questions about what exactly went on in that meeting. He frankly seems maybe out of the loop in terms of what happened. And I think the administration has problems when the press secretary answers a question about whether ambassadors like Michael McFaul, also of Stanford, could be called up by Russia to answer questions. They didn't seem to defend him. I think that those kind of issues raise huge questions as to what exactly the policy is on Russia and how tough they are going to be. It seemed like the president blinked by canceling that meeting in November with Putin.
And that's not the only point of confusion, because I want to talk about immigration, too. There's a lot of confusion over what exactly has happened here with the reunification of families. So, Marisa, was the deadline for reunifying families separated at the border met or not?
I mean, I think you could argue both sides, and I think that's what's happening in court. The question also is what can the judge do if it's not? And I think what we've seen is the administration, I think we should give them credit for making a good faith effort for getting those 900 families back together. But the question now is, especially what about the people that did get deported? And I think that's where a lot of the debate is happening in the courtroom, is over what parents agreed to, whether they understood what they were agreeing to, if they, say, signed and said, we don't want our children back. Clearly, this is not an issue that got wrapped up with a bow on Thursday. And I think, the judge has not seemed eager, and neither has the ACLU, quite frankly, who sued, to, impose sanctions or try to jail administration officials. I mean, there's really not a lot they can do. So I think the question is now, he's been very, I think, thoughtful and tried to take this sort of one issue at a time. So this is going to continue to play out.
Yeah, I think that this is a very difficult issue, but I think it highlights again the challenge with immigration policy and where we end up when there isn't a broader effort to get immigration right. And I think you've seen this in the Congress many times now, efforts at trying to advance immigration legislation failing. You've had the president on different sides of the issue. So I think that the challenge here is going to be, this issue is going to continue, but until the immigration system gets fixed generally, we are going to continue to see these kinds of crises develop. We saw one a couple of years ago during the Obama administration. This one arguably comes from the Trump administration's no-tolerance policy, but still, it's because Congress has not filled the void.
Yeah, and I think the issue is you've got the optics of this whole story. these stories of personal stories of parents being ripped away from their kids.
Well, about children and recognizing their parents.
Yes, you're seeing the videos every day. And you've got about 473 kids now who are still not brought back together with their parents, who have been deported. And there are questions about whether that can go on for months more. This is a story that is not going to go away. These headlines aren't. Although I think the administration and then the president himself often distracts with his tweets. Right. But the fact is that there are a lot of groups, human rights groups, watching this. And this, as we go toward November, I think this is an issue that plays with a lot of people.
And it shouldn't go away because these are real people.
Right.
And, you know, these children, I just cannot even imagine as a parent what it must be like for the parents or these young kids. I think these are situations, trauma that will play out for the rest of their lives. And I do think, you know, the difference between the unaccompanied minors and this is that the Trump administration rolled out a policy and then sort of it seemed like later decided to figure out what that meant. And so when you're talking about real human lives, that does have meaning. But of course, this is part of the whole immigration debate.
And so, Lanhee, how do you think this immigration issue will play out at the polls come November? I mean, the Republicans, I think, would want to keep the focus on an economic message. You have new numbers out today from the federal government saying in the second quarter, you know, economic growth tops 4%. Yeah. Those are pretty good numbers. So how will that all come out, and what role will immigration play as voters go to the polls?
I think there's a two-part strategy here. I think on the one hand, when you go into a midterm election, the one thing you need is a motivated base. If you do not have a motivated base, you are not going to do well. Immigration is an issue. Like it or dislike it, it plays to the Republican base. It's an issue that Republicans care deeply about when they vote. So motivating the base is one piece of it. The other piece of it is how do you appeal to independent voters for those swing districts, like we have several here in California in the Southland that are swing districts, and the way you appeal to them is with an economic pitch. The strong economy is something President Trump returned to today. I think he probably does get some credit for an economy that's growing at a relatively significant clip, and certainly since the election, that growth has continued. So it's a two-part strategy, both of which I think Republicans will execute in an effort to hold on to the House and the Senate.
I mean, I think also, like, we have to look at, we talked about this last week a little bit, how quickly things move. It's kind of early to say what we're going to be talking about in October, early November. I do think that this particular slice of the immigration debate doesn't stand to motivate people in the same way of the larger one when you talk about Republicans, because there was a lot of Republicans who were very horrified by what happened. And I think that does run the risk of turning off some of those more independent or moderate Republican voters. I mean, we had on Political Breakdown last night a DCCC guy, Drew Godnick, who's actually in California with another, dozen or so people on the ground for the Democrats. And I think what you hear from them is, of course, they're going to talk about that, but they want to talk about health care. They want to talk about other issues that resonate. And I mean, each district is different. So I think that's one of the things.
And this is an issue that can play in those races. Kevin McCarthy and Paul Ryan have both talked about promising immigration reform measures, but they're being sort of upended by conservative Republicans there in Washington.
Jeff Denham,
who want, E-Verify and other issues. This is a fight that is going to go on all the way, and it could affect those House races, the 7 particularly, that the DCCC is focused on.
And Carl, I want to also talk about tariffs with you, because the U.S. and the European Union have now agreed to hold off on any further tariffs and work on eliminating some current ones. But California farmers are already just starting to see some effects from other tariffs.
Yeah,
from
this
trade
is another
conflicts
place
with
where
Canada,
Kevin McCarthy,
Mexico.
Kevin McCarthy, the House Majority Leader, is really sort of in the focus here, because he's right there in the Central Valley, where you're talking about farmers that produce almonds, pistachios, citrus that go to the European Union, China, and Mexico. Those are our big trading partners, and they're not going to get any big piece of that $12 billion aid, which, by the way, is not really popular with a lot of Republicans. They're calling it gold-plated welfare for some of these farmers. So I think this is going to be the issue here, is how much do farmers, not only here in California, but in other places where Trump and the Republicans are going to need this support come November.
I mean, if we think about ways that the Republicans could step on their own economic message, it seems to me that the imposition of tariffs would probably be the worst thing they could do. If you talk about the things that could slow the economy as we look toward the end of 2018 and 2019, the imposition of tariffs seems to me to be significant, particularly as we get out toward the end of the year and some of the any positive benefit that might have come from the tariffs has washed away.
The
question will be, and the tax cuts is the other piece, and we begin to see us come off the sugar infrastructure, higher from the tax cuts. How does that affect the economy going forward? These are big issues politically.
Right. Well, for the time being, though, the tariffs seem to be part of a pattern that keeps emerging, right? President Trump says or does something widely viewed as outrageous, then he walks back from it. The tariffs, NATO,
Russia.
the Putin summit. Do you see this constant cycle of statement, retraction, then undermining the retraction as part of a larger strategy on his part?
It's hard to. I mean, this goes to his major profile as a great deal maker, and yet, as you said, he throws things out and retracts. Now, some of the Trump people are saying now on this tariffs issue, well, this is
we got what we wanted.
We got
right?
what we wanted.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, it really depends on what perspective you're coming from, but I think you're absolutely right. This is part of the narrative of Trump, and yet we've seen this sort of walk back every time.
I mean, I think this gets to this question that we've been debating, which is like Trump's base versus the larger Republican Party and what matters more. I think you're right. I think there's sort of some dog whistling there in the sense that you say something, it's outrageous, but maybe your base loves it. Then you walk it back to sort of acquiesce to Republicans in Congress and other voters. But the question is, what does that mean at the polls, and how many people did you turn off with that initial thing, with that initial message, who were maybe more swing voters? And remains to be seen.
Okay, I have to ask you guys about wildfires as well, because big problem in California right now. There are multiple wildfires. Yosemite had to be shut down. We have firefighters who have died. People were evacuated in Redding. And now state lawmakers are weighing the tough question of who should foot the bill for fires caused by equipment belonging to utilities like PG&E. Marisa, what are they thinking of doing?
Well, the governor finally came out with a proposal this week that essentially sort of seeks to change this California law that allows utilities to be held responsible for damage their equipment caused, even if they weren't negligent. So if they followed all the rules, but they still caused a fire. This is a big sticking point. PG&E and other utilities have been lobbying heavily both in the Capitol and sort of in the court of public opinion. They don't like this proposal. They don't think it goes far enough. Folks on the other side, like homeowners and insurers, hate it. So maybe it's a sweet spot, but they have till the end of August really to wrap this up. So we're going to have to see.
All right. Marisa Lagos with KQED, Lanhee Chen with the Hoover Institution, and Carla Manucci with Politico. Thank you all.
Thank
you.
And that will do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.